Yeah, thank you so much, Volker, for the introduction. So yeah, hello, Earthlings. I come in peace. So the work that I'll present is joint work with a number of collaborators. Volker already mentioned that we collaborate quite a bit with UN partners. So you'll see sort of, UNICEF listed here among others, IOM, but also with a number of academic partners who have contributed to this line of work over the years. Volker already mentioned that what I do is called sort of societal computing, and the way that I define is that it combines computing of and computing for society, right? So Volker already outlined this, right? Sort of computing of society is essentially the effort to sort of measure and understand societal phenomena, right? And if you want to study societies, at least today's societies, right, that often involves non-traditional data sources, right? Social media, but also satellite imagery, maybe internet data, etc. And then, but the other aspect, which is at least as important to me, is this sort of kind of so what question, right? So now we've measured something, we've understood something, we've written a paper, great, then what, right? Like, they're always, not quite half jokingly, but, maybe not jokingly say, I don't want to have my age index on my tombstone, right? Like when it's sort of, my obituary, right, says, oh, Ingmar wrote a lot of papers and that was highly cited, right? I hope not, right? Like sort of, right? And so this aspect really matters to me, right? I really try to sort of think about, okay, how can we work on topics that are not just theoretically interesting, but are also practically relevant, right, and impactful. Right? And hopefully you'll see this throughout the examples that I'll give in the talk, right? But then this, of course, also relates to the data sets you choose, right? Like if you choose to use data that's only accessible, 3 years after an event, then probably that's not of a lot of practical relevance, right? So that also then, of course, biases your research towards working with data sources that are a bit more sort of real time. Okay. So I'm sure you've heard the slogan, right? So if you're not paying for the product, then you are the product, right? And so essentially my talk is about what does this actually mean in practice. So here I'll switch to a live demo of different advertising platforms. And later I'll actually be happy to be interrupted even before the Q&A. You'll see that, this part I can really sort of adapt to the audience interest. So let me explain what you see here. So this is Facebook's, or now Meta's, advertising platform, right? And this is publicly accessible, right? You can create an account for free, right? You don't have to pay unless you actually launch the advertising campaign, right? But you'll see that actually you get all the information that I'll explain in a second actually for free. So here I'm in the step of planning an advertising campaign, right? So if I was to launch an advertising campaign targeting Facebook users in Norte de Santander, which is part of Colombia. This is on the border with Venezuela. So we have Venezuela in the east, Colombia in the west, right? And if I was to target all Facebook users 18 and above, and it's only Facebook, it's not Instagram and sort of others, right? Then Facebook tells me before I launch my targeting campaign that there are between 600,000 and 700,000, or 620 and 730,000 Facebook users that match my targeting criteria. Okay, so why is this interesting? Well, this provides us a sort of real-time census over Facebook users, right? Or if you're a computer scientist, like a count oracle, right? I can ask essentially count questions to Facebook. How many of Facebook users match certain criteria? And then I get an answer, right, in real time and at no cost, right? Because so far I'm always only at the planning stage, right? What if I was to launch a campaign? How many people would see my campaign, right? Or potentially see my campaign. Why does Facebook provide this information? Well, this matters for planning purposes, right? Like, maybe, I have different budget needs if they are like 100,000 or 10,000 or 1 million people matching my criteria, right? Okay, so now what can we do with this? Why did I choose Norte de Santander, right? Okay, so, I can drill down further, okay, by gender, right? So let's keep in mind, okay, so the upper limit is 730,000, right? Okay, so let's split this by, let's only look at men, and it's roughly half sort of this, right? So that's a good sign, right? That probably means that there's something, approximating gender equality, at least concerning the use of Facebook. But no more interesting for some of our work, we can also look at migration backgrounds. So I can look of these 350,000 men, how many used to live in Venezuela. So here you see all these sort of targeting criteria, lived in different sort of countries. One of them is in Venezuela, right? And so now if I select this, then it's roughly sort of 10%, slightly less than 10%, of the men in this age range, right, who used to live in Venezuela, right? And of course, this is an interesting number, right? Like sort of so in humanitarian migration context, right? It gives me estimates of the sort of the migrant stocks, so to speak, right? Like sort of so they're sort of like flows and stocks, right? Sort of so yeah, how many people, right? Like from country X are now living in country Y. Or then I can disaggregate these by age and gender, but I can also try to get a sense of the socioeconomic situation of these people. Okay, how would that work? Okay, so here you have you can target by device type or by operating system people use. Okay, so in particular, I can differentiate between Android and iOS. So let's select iOS for now. So then it goes down from sort of 30,000 to 2,800, right? Roughly another sort of 10%. Okay. Why is this interesting? Well, in general, right? And I'll try to quantify this more later, sort of or so, but in general, iOS devices are more expensive than Android devices. So if you have a group of people where the percentage of iOS usage is quite small, then that's typically indicative of lower socioeconomic status, right? I mean, there are exceptions sort of or so, like one is, for example, South Korea, where Samsung is based, where iOS usage is relatively low, right, for other reasons. But in general, and in particular across Latin America, sort of that holds true. Okay, now I'll show some examples for Facebook data, and then I'll show you some of the other sort of platforms. But first, let me illustrate what you can do with Facebook data. So this is data that's not live. This was collected a couple of years ago while I was still at the Qatar Computing Research Institute. This is why it says QCRI in the URL, right? And this is data from 2017, not live. This is just sort of to show what could be done, right? You probably recognize the city. This is the city of New York, right? But suppose you didn't know anything about the city and you wanted to understand the distribution of wealth. And you could ask, okay, where in the city is the density highest of iOS users? And now this area that lights up here with about 90% iOS usage is sort of, Manhattan Midtown is essentially the banking district, right? So here about 90% of Facebook users are using iOS devices. In the Bronx, it's only about 40 to 50%, or at least it was in 2017, right? And this would already probably suggest that there is a sort of, wealth differential between these two areas. Okay, you can also look at migration backgrounds, right? So here we've created this group of Latinos, essentially grouping different Latin American sort of countries. And you can look at, okay, where is their density highest, right? And again, sort of like part of the Bronx is sort of also neighboring sort of areas where about 40 to almost 50% of Facebook users used to live in a Latin American country, right, before living in this part of New York now. Now, in both of these cases, right, sort of, so first, if you live or if you've been to New York, you might say, oh, yeah, this actually rings true, right? That's not completely random, sort of, or so. And you can also, to a degree, validate this against open government data, right? So here, I'm not telling you anything that you could not find out through other data sources, right? But the point is, I can do this in other parts of the world where you don't have open government data, right? For example, this is now Doha, Qatar, right? So I used to live there for sort of 10 years, right? Doha has a lot, Qatar has a lot of data, but unfortunately no open government data, right? And so maybe you're interested in the Nepali migrant workers, right? So of course, there was a lot of written about them, and rightly so, right, in the context of the FIFA World Cup. So the density highest is highest in the so-called industrial area. Now again, here you don't have data to compare against, right? But if you Google industrial area Doha, right, you sort of see that this area was actually built to house migrant workers from South and Southeast Asia, right? So this is certainly, plausible. Also, having lived there, I can definitely assure, right, this is very, very plausible, right? They're also almost all men, right? This is also plausible because to bring over your family, you have to have a certain minimum income, right? And typically, these migrant workers don't have this minimum income, right? So they don't have a sort of visa, right? So they are fairly young, which was a blessing during COVID, right? Almost all of them were infected quite early on, right? But the fatality was actually quite low overall, right? And almost none of them are using iOS devices, right? Which are sort of typically more expensive. Now, if you contrast this with people from Western Europe and North America, they're concentrated in completely different parts of town, right? They don't overlap at all, right? And in fact, I lived both here and here during my 10 years in Qatar, right? Like sort of so quite stereotypical, right? I was there with my wife, right? So more gender balance, right? We are a university graduate. Now I'm in this age range, right? I used to be in the age range, but so you have more older knowledge expats, right? Like sort of also there. And you actually have more iOS device users than Android users, although actually I use an Android device, right? And again, right, not to bore you, but you can do this anywhere in the world, right? If you collect the data, of course, right? So this is now slightly more recent data. This is sort of also for Lagos. Maybe one word about these sort of shapes, right? Like, so in New York City, you actually have zip codes that you can target, and there are sort of known shapes associated with these zip codes. Doha doesn't have a zip code, so you just target by latitude, longitude with a certain radius, right? You just cover this. And then in Lagos, there are certain named neighborhoods, right? Sort of such as here, Ojokoro, but it doesn't come with a shapefile, right? So this is just why the visualizations look slightly different, but the methodology is very similar, right? Okay, so in Lagos, right, let's look at just one example. Again, iOS distribution. For some, I'll explain why, but there's a higher concentration here in Lagos Island, about 15%. Rest of Lagos drops sort of to somewhere between 5, 6, 7, maybe up to 8%. And then sort of the suburbs again sort of drops to maybe 5%. Right now, okay, here's already a question: is this plausible, right? If you read about Lagos, you see that this is actually the seat of the government, right? Like sort of Lagos Island, right? So this actually is plausible, right? That around where the government is located, there's higher wealth. Okay, I'll stop here with sort of Facebook, but I just briefly want to mention, right? What I showed you, it can be done for anything at all that has targeted advertising, right? So I'll just show quickly just a few others, right? So this is TikTok. Or you can say, oh, who cares about Facebook, right? That's for old people, right? That's what my grandma used, right? And you're sort of partly right, depending on the sort of geography, right? Well, guess what? TikTok also has an advertising platform, right? And so same thing, right? You have access to everything I show you here for free, right? You just Google, TikTok advertising platform, right? And you see this. So in TikTok, in Germany, according to TikTok, they're up to about 23 million. These are typically monthly active users, right? So of these sort of 23 million, you can look at the gender breakdown, right? Again, it's roughly sort of 50-50, right? Maybe you would expect this in Germany, right? So that's probably a good sign, right? But then again, you can sort of look for other sort of things, right? So maybe, I don't know, let's do a hashtag. Let's look at hashtag, what would be interesting, maybe climate change. No, what is it not? No, it does not bring up. My internet connection, not, or maybe I should, no? Okay, one of the things, right, it worked 10 minutes ago, now it's not working anymore, okay. I mean, theoretically, I'm not sure why it's not working now. Let me try something else. Let me try selecting something else. Okay, let's see, does this work? Okay, so this works. Okay, so now I can sort of here look at the interest in early childhood and preschool, right? Like sort of, so whatever that means, right? That's of course already one of the questions, how is this defined? And sort of compare, for example, gender roles, right? I could look at, okay, whether TikTok users in Germany or in different parts of Germany, right, are more stereotypical, right? Like maybe, I don't know, in more conservative areas, right? Only boys care about tech and electronics, and right, and women don't, or something, right? And you can say, oh, is this actually true, right? Like sort of, so does this actually hold for sort of short-form video content, right? Et cetera, right? Like maybe one other platform just to mention, right? Let's skip Snapchat. It's it's very similar to TikTok, but again, it also works. I'll briefly mention maybe YouTube. So Google has different sort of things, right? Like sort of, so I could have shown the display network. Maybe ask about this later, but here I'll show sort of, this is now video advertising, essentially YouTube, right? So here I had to select a quite short time range, essentially from today until today, more or less. In Germany, there are 300 million impressions, right? Like sort of, so an impression is essentially every one ad view, or sort of, sort of quite a lot, right? I can do similar sort of things, right? I can look at demographics, right? If you are logged into Google, right? Like sort of, so, right? Like then, and you have a Google account, right? You can look at, sort of, so how many, well, this is still too large. Okay, let's have to sort of make it a bit smaller to actually look at. Okay, so here it's 140 million female. Let's compare this sort of to male. Okay, actually interesting. So there's quite a lot more male, right? I did not expect this, right? So maybe this is an indication that men are watching more YouTube, or at least more content with ads, sort of, so, right? Like sort of, so, so this is something at least to generate an hypothesis, right? And again, you can sort of look at where the topics, not keywords, interest here, browse, what might be interesting, live events, college graduation, okay, I don't know, there's also something sort of, so autos, okay, right, sort of how many men, would, you could show an ad, I mean, who are interested in auto vehicles, right, sort of, you could show like an ad, right, and again, these are now not user counts, these are impression counts, right, so they're a bit harder to interpret, right, because you kind of have to correct for different activity levels, right, maybe there's just one subgroup who sort of, that's super active. In a sort of in-person talk, I would certainly stop here. I'll try to do this sort of. So is there like a question? Is there like one particular example that you'd love to see here or something? Because again, I can sort of adjust to your interests or sort of so. Right? Maybe while you sort of formulate a question, I'll just mention everything I showed you, right? These estimates you can collect programmatically, right? You don't have to do sort of screen scraping, right? Like in general, of these platforms try to make it easy for advertisers, right? Because that's a revenue model, right? You're not one of those pesky researchers, right, who tries to get data, right? Like sort of so. No, you're an advertiser, right, who wants to give them money, right? Like sort of so, right? And so you don't have to go through the back door, right? You come through on the red carpet, sort of kind of front door, sort of so, right? Like, additionally, there are sort of so these platforms have their native APIs, right? But they're also sort of wrapper APIs. So here's sort of if you like here's one wrapper API for the Facebook marketing API from the World Bank. Here's another one from a different team at the World Bank that's for sort of Python, and that also works for LinkedIn. I didn't show LinkedIn now, but it's essentially the same thing, right? You can ask how many people, right, like who studied at Saarland University now work in marketing in France or something, right? Like sort of, right? Like you can sort of, and on LinkedIn, you can also build company networks. Like how many people who are now at Google know somebody who's currently, I don't know, in the German government or something, right? You can sort of map, so how these sort of things. Let's have a quick look. There's one question. Maybe can we check news consumption to the categories? Yeah, that's possibly sort of so, right? Like I think because sometimes it really depends on if they show you people. I mean, in general, they show you people interested in certain things, right? You can sort of target. You can get a sense of how many impressions are there for people interested in news, but maybe not necessarily on news, if that makes sense, right? I could reach a person who's interested in news on a dog channel, right? Like sort of, right? I might run an ad on, like a political ad on a dog channel, because somehow that's where people interested in politics hang out, right? So yes, I think there is a signal sort of or so, but you have to look a bit more into this. This is something I have actually not explored in depth. I think TikTok is slightly different because it actually also shows you information on video interactions. You can sort of look at how many people watch videos to the end about certain topics, right? Like sort of, so there you might have more sort of consumption data that is, or here's sort of they're engaged with, and also sort of also the creation. So, but short answer is yes. I think there's a signal, but I have not yet used this in my own research. Okay, so then let me go back to the talk. But essentially, that was the most important idea to get across, right? So now you see there's some signal, but of course you can already guess it's a very sort of skewed, biased signal, right? Like who uses these platforms in the first place? What does it mean if Facebook tells me something is interested in something or used to live in another country, right? How do they infer this, right? Like, is there any sort of scientific validity to this data, right? Like sort of, right? So there's sort of, and essentially that's then where the research kicks in, right? So you have some sort of distorted signal of reality, but what do you do with this, right? Okay, so right. So in my own research, or sort of, so we mostly use such data to fill data gaps, right? Like sort of, and they broadly fall in sort of three buckets. So one is trying to bring down sort of recency, right? Sort of, so in many countries, right, rely on their sort of census data for planning or sort of so, but you have a new census every 10 years, right? So it's very slow, right? Like sort of, right? Another thing is sort of so geographic granularity, right? You might have a data point for, let's say, Uttar Pradesh, right? Like one of the Indian states, but I think that state alone, and apologies if my memory is wrong, has about like 200 million people in it or so, right? So if you have one data point summarizing 200 million people, it's not very actionable, right? What do you do? How do you use this for sort of, intervention planning, right? And then another dimension is sort of also often demographic disaggregation is missing, right? You might have a poverty statistics, in general, but maybe, in a household, only the male head of the household has access to the financial resources, right? And not the woman, right? And this might not show up in sort of typical measures of sort of poverty, right? But if all the men have the expensive devices and the women don't, right? Maybe it's a sort of, it gives you some sort of indication in terms of who has access to certain things. So depending on time, right? So these are sort of three example cases I could talk about, right? So one looks at monitoring migration in the Venezuelan context. One looks at tracking digital gender gaps, where in essence we look at gender gaps on Facebook usage to then predict gender gaps in terms of internet access and mobile phone usage. And the last looks at sort of mapping poverty and wealth. I already hinted at the sort of iOS versus Android a sort of signal. So the first use case here, again, this was done while I was at sort of QCRI, right, and looks at the Venezuelan exodus. Tiny bit of context, right? So we did this work, I think, in 2018. At that point, inflation in the country was 130,000%, right? So hyper-percent. It's not 130%, 130,000%, right? So hyperinflation. Unemployment was upwards of 35%. And then crucially, if you weren't earning a minimum wage, right, and spend every single of your, I believe it's bolivar on food, you could only afford 1,000 calories or kilocalories to be exact, right? So people were sort of starving under the so-called Maduro diet, right? And in response, of course, many people left the country, right? And so this is what it looks like sort of visually. So you have, this is actually in Norte de Santander, right, that I showed you before, right? You have Venezuela here sort of on the right or east, northeast, and you have Venezuela sort of on the left or west sort of, Colombia is left, Venezuela is right. So people are going from there to here. But how many people, right, like, and what type of people was, especially at the beginning of the crisis, not clear, right? And so somebody actually from UNICEF approached me, hey, you know, you've done some work on migration using non-traditional data sources. Can you help us estimate, you know, these migration flows? Okay, so what you see here is data that we collected over time. So let me try to slowly walk you through this graph. So whenever it says a location, it's always a host location, right? So when it says Colombia, it's people in Colombia, but this is always Facebook users who lived in Venezuela. Right? Okay, now this data point down here, for example, that was collected in June 2018, is just the raw number of Facebook users who at that point in time, right, like were living in Colombia, but previously lived in Venezuela, right? So if in June 2018, you went to the interface and essentially did what I showed you before, right, the value that you would have observed was around 1 million users. Now, if we assume that, right, there are no false positives in the set, right, that every single one of this is a migrant / refugee from Venezuela, then of course this would be an undercount, right? Not everybody uses Facebook, right? And so now, how do we correct for this, right? So ideally, we would like to know the Facebook penetration among migrants, right? So what percentage of migrants from Venezuela, right, uses Facebook? Unfortunately, we don't know this. So we do the next best thing. We try to estimate the overall Facebook population in the host country, right? So we look at, okay, what's the total number of people living in Colombia, right, more or less? What's the total number of Facebook users in Colombia? And then based on this, we compute the penetration rate. I think it was around 60% at the time. So we add missing 40% on top, right? So this is a very, very simple and crude sort of assumption, right? Like right? Probably the Facebook penetration among migrants is higher than among the overall population, right? So probably the true value is lower than this, right? So it gives us sort of like a plausibility range or sort of, right? And then we sort of collect this data regularly over time, right? So in red is for Colombia, and the other colors are sort of for other countries in Latin America. Now, you always can get some value. Now, the question is, you know, is this a reliable value, right? Like, would you actually base anything on it? Would you actually use this sort of for planning purposes, right? And so let's compare against some other statistics. And so this is now these data points in black. So these come from two different UN reports collecting at sort of at two different points in time. And these are for all of Latin America. So the reference is not the red, but the gray. So the gray is all of Latin America from Facebook, and these data points are sort of Latin America from these UN reports, right? And you see that they are sort of broadly in a similar range, right? At least the sort of Facebook-derived estimates are certainly sort of plausible, right? They're not 10 times too big or just like a tenth of what you would expect, right? But probably Facebook would suggest a bigger value than these reports. But you even see that these two reports are sort of inconsistent with each other, right? Because they use sort of different methodologies or sort of, right? And this also shows you already the inherent uncertainty, right? Like sort of, so when it comes to estimating these things, right? Okay, so they're sort of, yeah, probably plausible, but sort of hard to validate, right? And of course, we do this because we don't know the ground truth. But if we already knew how many people exactly, you know, whether to begin with, right? Sort of, so we would do this in the first place. But this now, of course, creates certain challenges related to sort of scientific validity. Let me show you one other example where we sort of try to validate things. This is now subnational data, right? So this is now only for Colombia. On the left, you have data from the Colombian government or the sort of, you know, the administrative branch, handling migrant registrations, sort of so. On the right, you have data from Facebook. Here, this is Norte de Santander, right? This sort of this red point here. Now, if you compare these two, right, again, you see some similarities, right? Sort of for Norte de Santander, they are sort of reasonably similar. Generally, both have, higher numbers closer to the border, right? Like sort of so. But then if you go away from the border, if you look at sort of Bogota, right, the capital region, then Facebook would suggest quite a bit higher numbers than in the sort of official statistics. Now, in most analysis, right, official statistics are, ground truth, gold standard, right? And you validate against this. Therefore, this is not very accurate, right? Like sort of so. However, because we were working with people in Colombia, they actually told us, you know what? The data that you get from Facebook is more in line with what we observed on the ground than the data from the government, right? And their hypothesis was that this data from the left is based on voluntary self-registration data, right? Basically, welcome to Colombia, please, remember to go to the, Bürgeramt, right, the sort of city hall, right, sort of to register, right, like have a nice day, right? And based on their accounts, right, sort of, so at least based on the stories, right, sort of, so these efforts were more successful closer to the border, but not so much further, away from the border, right? Once you've made it all the way to Bogota, right, somewhere in Colombia, the incentive to then register might no longer be there. It might no longer be top of your mind, sort of, right? So punchline again, we don't know at the end of it, right? I cannot exactly tell you, right, like what's the R squared or the sort of, or some sort of measure of accuracy, but at least anecdotally, people on the ground suggest that data collected by a gigantic corporation for profit is more accurate than data, collected deliberately for this purpose by the government concerned, right? Like sort of, and that's at least interesting, right? Like sort of to reflect on what this actually means. For other countries, right, there was no data available, so this was the only subnational data existing at the time. I already hinted at before that you can go beyond just the raw numbers by trying to get a sense of the sort of socioeconomic situation, right? So here again, every location is always a host location, right? So there's always people from Venezuela. The order of these locations is according to iOS usage. So on the very left, you have Roraima, Brazil. This is the jungle bordering Venezuela, right? Sort of so, where people typically go to on foot, right? You have this sort of caminantes. And there, only 3% of Facebook users who used to live in Venezuela have an iOS device. If you go to the other end, right, so the people who made it all the way to the United States, actually most of them are using iOS devices, right? So this sort of induces this order of likely sort of so very vulnerable to maybe not so vulnerable, right? Like from left to right. Now the question is, how do we get from this order to this y-axis, right? There's actually a dollar value here on the y-axis. What does this sort of mean, right? And for this, we train a regression model that predicts country level per capita GDP using only the percentage of Facebook users in that country that use iOS. Okay, so let me explain. Suppose that in Argentina as a country, the GDP was $30,000 per year, right? And suppose that in Argentina, 20% of Facebook users are using iOS devices, right? So then this regression model would learn, okay, 20% iOS users maps to more or less $30,000, right? So using just a single variable, right? And just using the single variable, right, like works actually surprisingly well, right? It explains almost 90% of the variance in per capita GDP of Latin American countries. Right, it's a very, very simple model. Now, once we have this model, we apply it to the subpopulations, right? So if the people from in Roraima were their own country, then this country would probably have a per capita GDP of maybe $4,000, right? It would be a fairly poor country, right? And if, right, the Venezuelans in the US were their own country, then, right, they'd have a per capita GDP of, almost $60,000, right? Now, these dollar values are not, meant to be sort of precise, and actually it depends a bit on which country you include in your training data or not, right? You will get a slightly different regression model, right? Sort of, so there are sort of bars, sort of, kind of like you have to imagine error bars around this. But in all of our analysis, we always observe these three groups emerge, right? Where we are reasonably comfortable saying that people who essentially stay in the vicinity, right, the neighboring countries, right, are probably worse off financially speaking, right, than people who, generally stay in Latin America, right, but make it all the way to sort of to Chile or Argentina, and people who make it all the way to, Europe or the US in general, right, it's not at the individual level, but in general, right, they're probably less vulnerable than the first two groups. Right? And again, this is sort of, useful information sort of to know. And again, you can sort of even look at sort of potentially sort of temporal changes. Great. Again, we were happy. This was sort of like all, right, this sort of kind of computing off society, right? But again, there was this sort of for society angle, right? Like, so we were happy that this was actually of direct operational use to, relief agencies who are working in the, on the humanitarian efforts. So both UNHCR and UNICEF actually used this data. Continues to be used by a local NGO called IMAP, right? So essentially, right, sort of they worked with us, we showed them how to collect this data, right, and now they're doing the analysis themselves. And that's also great because, of course, it's also about sort of capacity building, right? Like it should not be me looking at, issues in, Colombia sort of going forward, right? Like sort of, so that's sort of problematic for many reasons, right? Like sort of, so like a whole white colonialism and sort of other debate. So we're happy that, that now is sort of like local people continuing this. Great, but also to talk about some of the limits or the sort of pitfalls, right? Sort of, so let me show you this graph. So this is a very simple data visualization that we created in particular for UNHCR, that where the top line just shows the raw number of likely migrants, right? So the Facebook users who used to live in Venezuela, but were living in Brazil, right, over time. And you see the number sort of tick up until maybe sort of March, April, sort of 2019, and then suddenly it actually goes down, right, like sort of. Right? And so why is that, right? This is like return migration. That would be great, like continuing onwards to Argentina. Well, actually, in that period, Facebook changed its algorithm of how they classify people as having lived in Venezuela. How do we know? It's not we get an email from Facebook, or sorry, you might want to know this. No, we only know this because we collect this data regularly for all combinations of countries, right? We also collect data for how many French people are living in Australia, how many Germans are living in India, sort of, so, right? And exactly the same point in time, all of those numbers jumped down by, I think, 15, 20% or something, right? And, this was pre-pandemic. There was no external, major migration shock or something or sort of, so, right? So clearly this is sort of like an artifact, right? Like sort of, right? And so, yeah, we are reasonably sure of saying, okay, well, Facebook pushed a new algorithm to production, right? Like sort of, so, and in fact, a year later, the numbers jump back up again, right? So it's never have a certain cycle. And this again shows you some of the limitations now, right? So now, right, imagine you're saying, oh, we no longer need the census, we just use the social media stuff, right? Like sort of, so, right, for our official statistics. And then, the company says, oh, you know what, we just, here's something new, right? Like go, enjoy something, right? Of course, that's problematic, right? Now, there are ways you could correct for this, right? If right, you could, imagine like you just cut it out, right? You have some correction factor, blah, blah, blah. You make it continuous, right? It's not the end of the world, but again, it sort of shows you the struggling. Of course, it questions also, right? So what exactly are they measuring, right? Like it somehow seems to correlate with reality, but if they can just change the definition, what does it actually mean? Last thing, and then maybe I'll skip some things. This sort of, so this also, we've done some of the work, not just looking at out migration, right, sort of cross border, but also internal displacement. This is joint work in particular with the University of Oxford, where we look at Ukraine. So here's data from Kiev from the beginning of the war. So what we do here is we look at the daily active users. Previously, it was monthly active users. The daily active users actually fluctuate a bit more often. And in the country itself. And then we see, okay, there are less and less Facebook users in Kiev. We assume, maybe people are leaving Kiev, right? And in particular here, we see the number of sort of women has gone down more, or female Facebook users has gone down more than the number of male Facebook users, or right, or sort of. So based on this, right, we would then model link this to actual population changes, right? If half the women leave on Facebook, we say half the women actually leave the city, right? Like sort of, so I mean, with some asterisks attached to it, right? Like sort of, right? And again, you get at least something plausible, right? Sort of, so the number of women has gone down more than the number of men, right? Because men were sort of still are supposed to sort of not leave the country and sort of stay behind and potentially sort of fight, right? Like sort of, so against the invasion. Just two words here, you'd see there's both 0 to 4-year-olds and also 80+-year-olds. These are actually not groups you can sort of target on Facebook. I'll just briefly mention how this works. So here the demographers had actually quite interesting assumptions, quite clever, I would say, that ties the number of children to the number of women in a certain age range, right? So the assumption being, if the mother leaves, the child leaves, It's a big assumption, right? But that's sort of like a modeling assumption, right? And then they sort of see, mothers have a certain age distribution. So if this age distribution is affected, a certain number of children will be affected, right? Like sort of. So, and then these are very simple assumptions, sort of. So, but under these assumptions, right, you can try to estimate the number of children that might or might not be still there. I'll briefly show this, but I'll skip most of the details. So now I'll talk about a different topic, tracking digital gender gaps. This is again joint work with the University of Oxford, in particular Ritti Kashyap, and an NGO called Data2X that tries to fill sort of gender data gaps. So here we created this platform, right, digitalgendergaps.org, where maybe I'll actually first start with this data. So what you see here now is data from the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union, on the ratio of female to male internet users. Okay, so what does this sort of mean, right? If I look at, for example, Germany, there's a value of 0.926. That roughly means that for every 1 man with internet access, there are 0.926 women with internet access. I mean, assuming it's a 50-50 balance in the population, sort of corrects for this, right? Like sort of, sorry. And so you sort of see that most of Western, Europe is doing reasonably well in this official data. Italy is lagging a bit behind, but it's not horrible. It's 0.88 sort of for side, but then many other parts of the world are not doing so well. And also many countries are not reporting this data, right? Like Canada is missing, South Africa is missing, or sort of, so India is missing, right? And so now what we do in this work is we use this data for training or sort of ground truth to then train a model that uses Facebook data to predict the missing data, right? So here we have different model choices. This online model uses only Facebook data, right? And so now trained on the data that we trust from the ITU, right? We now make predictions for the other countries, right? So now we can, for example, look at what's going on in India. And furthermore, because we've been doing this for several years now, we can see that it seems that the situation in India is ever so slightly increasing, or has ever so slightly increased over the past 5 years, right? And now you can imagine right now we're doing this sort of also subnationally, also with support from the Gates Foundation, looking in particular at Africa. I'd skip the rest of this because I want to have time essentially for a bit of discussion, right? And I also hinted at before that we're also looking at sort of poverty, right? And punchline is, yeah, that actually also works reasonably well. Yeah, maybe a couple of words on this, right? This was all passive use, right? We never spent a single cent, right? We just collect these advertising audience estimates, but you can use it actively to actually run an ad, right? And you can do this for different sort of things. Here on the right is a study that we did with people from the University of Passau, where we recruited people in Indonesia into a diabetes screening website. So basically say, hey, come to this website. What's your BMI? Do you have a family history of diabetes? Do you regularly exercise? Right? Do you eat your vegetables? And then you get like a score, right? Like sort of so. If the score is high, say, well, it's not a diagnosis, but please go and see a doctor, right? In your own interest, sort of so you might have diabetes, right? And then if people allowed, we would follow up later. By the way, right, we told you to go to a doctor. Did you actually go to a doctor? And if so, did they find something? And based on their response, we can estimate how much money we would have to spend for a newly diagnosed diabetes case, right? Where somebody, because of this advertising campaign and because of the screening, actually ends up going to a doctor and being diagnosed, right? Like how much did we have to spend per such new case, right? And it was around $10, which is actually quite cost effective, sort of, so in the greatest scheme of things, because if you diagnose diabetes early, that's actually quite impactful, right? So just I mentioned this, and this is now out in NPJ, or it has been accepted for publication, will be out shortly in NPJ Digital Medicine. Okay, so now, okay, what's sort of the end, right? So to quickly recap, right, you can do this for many other platforms, right? Like even for Weibo, right, like in China, or Kontakte in Russia, right? Like if you want to study social media in other countries, relatively real time, right? It's anonymous. So I don't think privacy is the biggest concern. I'll come to that. You can disaggregate by many things, and it's free of charge, right? Downside is black box, right? We don't know exactly what is being measured, right? Like people interested in something, having lived in some country. Okay, how do they know? What do they mean, right? Like sort of, so how long do they live there, right? What are they measuring, right? It's of course not representative, right? Like sort of, so of course, I mean, I think no need to discuss this. These platforms use a gender dichotomy, right? Like you're either male or female, right? Like sort of, so that also does not, represent reality. usage patterns change over time. So, you know, even if you have a system that perfectly predicts internet access, gender gaps, right, using Facebook data today, 5 years down the line, it will no longer work, right? It's just, you know, the usage changes all the time. What does it mean and why people use and the price point and you know, all these sort of things, right? So you always have to sort of retrain and recalibrate your model, right? There's no historic data available, right? If you ask me, oh, great, that's great. I would have loved to study something during COVID, right, using such data. I said, sorry, right? If you didn't collect this data, right, you're out of luck, right? It's only as of today, right? I mean, we have some data related to migration, right? But for anything else, I can't help you. Last but not least, there's a risk of misuse. So let me expand on this. So yeah, sort of fun story, right? Like, okay, Hitler came to power in 1933, right? Like and fortunate for him, the census was already planned for April that year. One of the goals of the census was to identify Jews, Roma, and other minorities. Right? This was even planned before Hitler. Right? And now Hitler was lucky that in that year, for the first time, there was, you know, data science innovation, right? Like it was not AI or something or big data, but it was punch cards and IBM. Okay, and because of this, they were able to do so-called record linkage. So previously, they would just ask you, are you Jewish? No? Well, then you're not Jewish. Okay. Now they will ask you, okay, you're not Jewish. Well, let me go to your grandfather. Oh, your grandfather says he's Jewish. Okay. Now these two records could for the first time be linked, right? They have to sort through all these sort of punch cards and sort of link this. This is this linkage between these records. Previously, that was not possible. Let's just imagine somebody has to sort, you know, millions of cards by hand and sort of, you know, put them next to each other, right? Like sort of. So now it was possible, right? Because of this data innovation, you know, the estimates of, you know, people with Jewish entry jumped from 500,000 to 2 million, right? So, you know, suddenly we had better data, right? Like thanks to clever computer scientists, right? And isn't that wonderful, right? And so in a sense, yeah, better data was then used to sort of optimize the Holocaust, right? Like sort of, right? Now, yeah, what does this mean sort of for the work that I showed you, right? Like sort of, right? So for example, so people from the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, when I showed them, they said, okay, yeah, it's nice, Nepalis in Qatar, whatever, but can you map the Rohingya, right? Like sort of, right? So can you map ethnic minorities, right? Like in a country where arguably there's a genocide going on, right? Like sort of, right? I mean, because then maybe the government actually would like to use that data for better targeting, right? Or so. Fortunately, I could not, right? In the particular case, the minority is so disenfranchised that in general, they don't seem to have a lot of internet access, let alone you know, Facebook usage, right? But there are other groups, right? Like sort of, right? We do see Mexicans in the US in our data. And in some of our models, we actually predict more Mexicans than in official statistics, right? Now, our models are noisy, right? They're by no means ground truth or sort of, right? But the official data is also not perfect, right? Like sort of, so what does it mean, sort of, right? And so those are sort of things that sort of concern me. So I'm not concerned about, oh, you know what my uncle something did in some country. No, this is first impossible, and I also don't care, right? But sort of mapping, right? Like where in Germany people are interested in Jewish holidays or something that you can do, right? Like maybe there's no risk in the current government, but who knows, right? Like what down the road some other government might want to do, right? With people, okay, where in Germany are people interested in the Holy Quran, right? Like, okay, right? You know, you can do that. What do you do with that information, right? And then related, right? Sort of. So who benefits, right? I mean, again, I hope, right, that my work directly, right, benefits humanitarian efforts, right? Like sort of. So having said that, right, you also have to be sort of critical, right? Sort of. So could other entities, you know, use my research or all these methods or sort of, right? And so, for example, Frontex is hiring, right, understandably data scientists, right? And so it's a somewhat recent job description, right? If you read it, right, it's all about social media, satellite imagery, data innovation, non-traditional data, right? Like it reads almost like, you know, what I write in the intro of some of my papers or something, right? Like sort of, right? Or why this is cool to do, right? But who would benefit from this? It's not clear, right? I mean, you can have different views, right? Like, but it might just lead to, like, you know, Fortress Europe being, you know, having higher fences or sort of, so, right? Like, or more electronic fences and sort of digital surveillance, right? Because there's an inherent sort of power imbalance, right, in terms of who has access to these technologies or so. Yeah, and so just sort of to close, right? So again, you know, a lot of this work is motivated by this mantra, better data will lead to better decisions. And again, I hope that this is the case, right? Like in some cases, right? But also to be realistic, maybe not always, right? So when it comes to global warming, we've had good data for decades, right? It's not that, oh, we need this one more good climate study and then finally we know what to do or something or sort of. So no, that's not the bottleneck, right? Like sort of. So often it's not that, oh, we have to map poverty with ever greater precision, right? And then we will eradicate poverty suddenly, sort of. So we don't have good data about where the poor people are. That's the reason we have poverty, right? That's probably not true, right? Like sort of. So it's the same with gender gaps or something. Oh, we can map gender gaps ever more precisely, and then we can finally eradicate gender gaps, right? Yeah, I wish, right? Like sort of. So, and hopefully, again, all of this contributes sort of to raising awareness and other things. But of course, just having data itself does not actually fix those issues. Yeah, so thanks. Hopefully, we still have a bit of time for questions, and otherwise, feel free to send me an email after the talk, and I look forward to the Q&A.